Good afternoon. I'm John Hess, General Manager here at WUWM. I want to thank you for attending our first virtual event to talk about the Democratic National Convention and the upcoming 2020 elections that are so important to our state. I want to thank our guests from NPR, and I want to thank you for joining us today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce your host for this afternoon, Joy Powers.
Thank you so much for joining us. As John has just said, my name is Joy Powers. I'm a host of Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, and this is what I look like over the next couple of hours, or over the next hour. Don't worry. I'll be joined by a couple other people who you're more used to hearing than seeing, talking about an event that we're not seeing too much of here in Milwaukee. The Democratic National Convention is happening right now this week. And while Milwaukee is still considered the host city, the vast majority of the convention is happening digitally because of concerns about the spread of coronavirus. But the convention isn't the only part of this election that has been fundamentally different because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything from campaigning to debating will be different from anything we've seen before. I'm joined now by Asma Khalid to talk about the convention, the election, and the pandemic's impact on all of it. And we want to hear from you. What questions do you have about this upcoming election? Let us know in the comments. We may take some of those questions and ask Asma for you. You might be familiar with Asma as the co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She is also a political correspondent for NPR, and she's the main reporter on the Biden-Harris campaign. Asma, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, of course, I'm speaking to you from Wisconsin, where I'm thinking under normal circumstances, you would have been for the convention.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually had a ticket booked, to be honest, a hotel booked that we had to cancel.
Where were you going to stay?
I don't know because everybody else was. I want to say, was it a Days Inn or they booked it. One of the producers booked it all, but I booked the hotel. The flight, and we were all pumped to be there up until just a few weeks ago when it was announced that even Joe Biden would not be there himself.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to see our recombobulation area at some point soon. Now, this election year has been decidedly atypical. How has it been so far covering a campaign that has been largely conducted remotely? And as you just said, there's been a lot of changes happening very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Joy, look, no doubt it's been challenging. And for the first couple of months of the year, I pretty much lived out of a suitcase. I would hardly ever unpack it fully because I knew I was going to hop on another flight. This is, between Iowa up until Super Tuesday. And then everything just really ground to a halt. And I have not been extensively traveling since about March. I've been fortunate enough. I was actually out in Wisconsin, able to do some reporting in Kenosha and some reporting also in Michigan and Florida. But these have all been driving trips, largely voter focused. When you talk about covering Joe Biden, he normally, any normal presumptive nominee would have a plane full of journalists following him to every event, these massive rallies. Those aren't happening now. And so what he does are these smaller scale events, mainly in Delaware, where I'm at right now, or in Pennsylvania. And there's just a handful of reporters who are let in. It's a pool situation, meaning that, it's generally just a couple of journalists who cover print or broadcast and radio. And then we all share our notes with one another. So it's nothing at all like what a normal campaign ought to feel like the summer leading up to the election.
Well, and that has to present a lot of challenges. What are some of these challenges that you see that the Biden-Harris campaign is facing as a result of this campaign not being able to have more of an on-the-ground presence?
So I would say one of the biggest challenges that I think both the campaign and then those of us who report on the campaign are feeling in this moment is the difficulty of getting a real pulse on what voters think. And look, the campaign will tell me, and state Democratic parties have told me that they are making phone calls or texting voters, et cetera. But also people who organize admit that some of the best organizations that you can do are face-to-face front porch conversations. And those, at least for the Democrats, have been put on hold for the most part at this point. And what I will say is that, as a reporter, I really relish the opportunity to go to large scale rallies and hear from voters about what they're thinking and go to different communities that we know are going to be really important in the election and do that. And, I mentioned I have been traveling a bit, but even when I travel, it requires so much legwork to pre-interview people, try to make sure that you're in the right place. When I was in Florida, the pandemic situation was a lot more volatile than it was even in the Midwest. And so I had to essentially interview, I think, just about everybody outdoors. And that presents challenges, on its own of just figuring out where to go and where to be. And also in this climate, not everybody really wants to spend an extra couple of minutes talking to someone face to face, whether or not you have a mask on.
It has to be difficult. This is one of the big questions that I had as somebody who isn't, a pool reporter, isn't a campaign reporter in that way. It has to be difficult to really gauge the energy behind either campaign, Biden, Harris, Trump, Pence. What are the ways that you have found to work around the conditions that we find ourselves in? What are the ways that you reach out to voters and gauge how they're feeling right now?
So I will say, much like what the campaigns are doing, the phone has become my very good friend. And so I spend a good chunk of time on the phone, whether that's, checking in with the Biden campaign, talking to people within his orbit, people close to him that we think could, offer us some insights, or calling folks, whether it's the state Democratic Party chair in Michigan or Florida, et cetera, where I'm going to be going. And so before I go to any community, I have spent probably at least a week really sort of substantively on the phone with different people that I know I want to talk to, whether it's Democratic leadership or Republican leadership, and not just leadership. I mean, it's sort of like you ask one person for guidance on who to talk to, and they'll give you a half a dozen other names, and then you call those people. And it has required a lot more prep before you're ever able to go out to a particular place. Also, you can't really bank on the fact that you can go to what we like to call kind of man on the street interviews that you might do at a beach or in a grocery store parking lot. Those places aren't necessarily going to be as crowded as they might always. I mean, it depends. I was actually out on the lake in Wisconsin earlier this summer, and there were a good number of people to talk to who were happy to speak to a reporter. And I think it was just a nice day, so people were eager to get out there. But my point is I think the phone and making sure that you're keeping in communication with people and really maintaining relationships has felt far more pivotal this election cycle, because I can't meet those people often face to face. And secondly, the other sort of main indicator that I follow a lot are polls. And look, I know a lot of people are skeptical of polls given some of what we saw an over-reliance on in 2016. But I'm a big believer that you don't just take polls as sort of indicative of what the election results will be, but they are snapshots of this moment in time. And specifically, when we look at state polls and a number of state polls, when we look at trends, those can be telling. And I will say, I think the campaigns are following them. For example, President Trump, we saw that some of his tough on crime messaging wasn't going over particularly well with suburban voters. And we have seen a bit of a shift from him. And we've seen a bit of a staff shakeup as well, as a result of him not seeming to do as well in some of these polls.
Yeah, that's a question, I think, coming out of 2016 that a lot of us had. Should we rely on polls? What are the polls that we should look at and we should consider? When you're looking at polls, how do you gauge whether or not this is something that's reliable?
I mean, one thing I think that's really helpful to look at is how large of a sample size it was, right? So if you're talking about a poll of 100 people that was across, say hypothetically, the entire state of California, and they didn't really particularly try to model off of making sure that they had, an equal distribution of, say, education levels and races, I think that's a pretty moot poll, But I think that you look at how large the sample size is. You look if they're waiting for certain things like education levels or race. And you also look at who's conducting the poll and how reputable of a source that is. I know, for example, the Pew Research Center, when they do polling, and they don't do as much or as frequent polling as some of these other outlets do, they have a pretty large sample size. And so I find that to be really helpful. But really, Joy, I think what's more helpful for me has been to look at trend lines and to look at, are we seeing systematic repetition across like 5 or 7 polls. And if they're all showing us relatively the same thing, to me, that's something indicative to pay attention to. And the other last thing I will say is there's a poll actually that came across my desk just earlier today because I've been really interested in what they're doing. It's a group called the Voter Study Group, and it's a group of political scientists who decided to do this survey where it's a I guess you call it like a longitudinal survey. And so they interview approximately every week over 6,000 Americans. And they've been doing this, I believe, since the beginning of 2019. And so the goal is leading up to the election, they'll have conducted 500,000 interviews across every county, every congressional district, and every mid-sized U.S. city. And it's really, to me, sort of an unprecedented view into what public opinion looks like. And I think that what it isn't so much about like who's up and who's down, Joe Biden's up or Donald Trump up. It's a much deeper glimpse into what are public opinion issues, what are some of the issues motivating voters, what do they think about X, Y, or Z topic. And to me, that's actually really helpful because we know some of those issues do motivate voters. It's not just about whether or not, say, Joe Biden is up or Donald Trump is up on a given day, because I think those things are fluid, and we all know that. I mean, I look back at 2016 and it seems like, we know Hillary Clinton had a lead up until a certain point, and then that lead very quickly evaporated. And I don't need to tell this to any of you all out in Wisconsin, but I also don't think that there was substantive, really good polling in a number of key states that mattered. I think, Wisconsin, in my view, was not polled as frequently or as enough as it should have been.
Yeah. So what was the name of that poll again, just so people, if they want to pay attention to it, they can?
Sure. So it's put out by it's called the Voter Study Group. It's by a group of political scientists. They have this group called the Democracy Fund. And the actual survey's name is called Nationscape. It's all one word. You may have heard about it because they've done some collaborations. I think they were reported on in it was Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today. But they've been essentially surveying voters, thousands of voters every week since the beginning of 2019.
All right. So turning back to the campaign, last week, of course, Harris was announced as Biden's running mate. How do you think these two fit together on this ticket?
It seems like they complement one another. He is significantly older than her. He is 77. And while, conventional wisdom is that a running mate doesn't really substantively alter the way that people will vote, in the case of Joe Biden, there have often, and there were going to continue to be questions, I think, up until Election Day about who his running mate would be, given the fact that, we don't know if he'll run for a second term and just given his elderly age. And so Kamala Harris is in her 50s. She is a multiracial woman of color from California. So I would say, by and large, she represents something that is very different than him. When you talk about ideology, though, she was somebody throughout the primary season, because she did run for president herself for a bit, that I don't know that we clearly knew where she stood. There were people within the Democratic Party like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders who were on the far left progressive side of where the party was. And then there was someone like a Joe Biden who was much more centrist. I think that Kamala Harris tried to find wiggle room to stand somewhere in the middle, and it wasn't always clear that she was able to do that. In my view, ideologically, she is more similar to Joe Biden, but she's able to represent something generationally and racially that is very different than what he does.
Well, and that's a question I think a lot of voters have. There are some progressives, specifically in the party, who believe that Kamala Harris is too much of a centrist, which when paired with Biden makes a very center-left ticket. But what does her record as a politician really show us about her? What does that say about her policies?
So I want to address first, Joy, the thing you mentioned about, the ticket being a centrist ticket, because ultimately Joe Biden has said this himself, and I would argue that some of the most successful presidential and vice presidential running mate combinations have been people who are, as Biden says, simpatico. They are ideologically similar, right? They trust one another. And I think that when a candidate chooses somebody purely to reach out to, say, a constituency, and they don't seem to be as ideologically aligned, voters see that, and it hasn't been particularly successful. And you just need to look back at, say, John McCain and Sarah Palin. There was thought that Sarah Palin could reach out to women voters, to sort of a different branch of the Republican Party, right? Whether that was ideologically very different than where John McCain was. And I have spoken to a number of strategists, some Republican who even worked for McCain, and there is an acknowledgement that that decision did not add up in terms of the VP choice. What I will also say is that leading up to the convention, I have spoken to a number of progressive organizations. And really, Joy, there is a consensus amongst progressive organizations that I did not hear in 2016, that this time is different. One organizer told me that he feels like this election is the most important election in his lifetime, and he thinks that there is agreement amongst progressive groups that they know that. Another organization has decided to put up $7 million to invest in the election. They did not endorse anyone in 2016. And so in my view, at least when we talk about the progressive leadership, progressive organizations, they are lockstep behind Joe Biden because of the sense that they have seen Donald Trump in action for a couple of years. Now, that all being said, does that mean that actual progressive voters are going to be energized to come out and support Joe Biden, particularly if there are obstacles, right, to showing up on election day in the midst of a pandemic? I don't know that we know the answer to that. But to me, that was some of what you heard Michelle Obama also herself trying to address last night, which was the urgency to get out and vote. And the sense that if you think the past couple of years haven't been too bad, as she said, she feels like it could potentially get worse.
Now, some people have looked at Harris as a candidate who could galvanize support from the Black community, which is going to be really important here in Wisconsin, specifically here in Milwaukee, where I am right now. We saw less Black voters coming out in 2016 than they did in 2012 and 2008. In what ways is the Biden-Harris campaign reaching out to Black voters in specifically states like Wisconsin?
Joy, I think that's an excellent question. And the pandemic has made it certainly more challenging for them to do on-the-ground field organizing. There is a thought, and maybe not even thought isn't the right word. There is certainly an energy and excitement among some leadership within the Democratic Party, Democratic activists who are African-American for Kamala Harris. And prior to Joe Biden selecting her, I heard from many of them who had been pressuring him to choose a Black woman, and they felt like this moment necessitated that, just given the racial protest in the country. I heard from some of them after the decision to choose Kamala Harris, and they told me that they felt validated. They felt like their opinions and their views had been taken seriously. Now, that all being said, these are activists within the party, largely at a national level. Is that going to matter to voters, African-American voters in Milwaukee who did or didn't show up in 2016? I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is when I look at states, again, like Michigan or like Florida, which I would argue Michigan is maybe more analogous, but Michigan also has a sizable African-American population that did not show up. One of the things I was struck by is that the state party chairperson told me that they are already, and this was maybe a month ago, at far higher staff numbers of engagement than they ever were for Hillary Clinton. And so there is, I think, widespread recognition amongst Democrats at both a state level, organization as well as a national operation that what happened in 2016 was partly due to a lack of investment of resources. And so it seems like this, and I've heard this even actually from Wisconsin as well, that there is greater investment of resources. Now, the challenge, Joy, comes back to the fact that you can't knock on doors. You can't actually do a lot of the groundwork organizing that people traditionally do. So if you have more staff and they're texting and they're phone calling, is that going to be sufficient? I just am not entirely sure. And I don't know that any of us know because we've never really lived through an election like this one.
It's true. It's so atypical. I mean, just a few months ago, we were talking about how the DNC was going to impact voting patterns here in Wisconsin. And now in some ways we're talking about how the lack of a DNC actually being here in Milwaukee is going to impact voting patterns in Wisconsin. Do you think that's going to have much of an impact on whether or not people come out to vote? Because there's been a lot of questions on either side of whether or not this would actually matter.
But if the convention had actually physically taken place in Milwaukee.
Yes, as opposed to.
Yeah. So there is this assumption that there's a convention bounce generally that the respective party receives, Democrats or Republicans. What I'm also even interested in, Joy, is whether or not we'll even see the parties, in the next week or two get that convention bounce, because these are not events that are being shown over broadcast TV for multiple hours. These are largely virtual events. Many people, if they are listening, are maybe catching a snippet on social media or something, or maybe on their public radio station, but they're not necessarily tuning in to hours and hours of coverage. But to your question, Joy, it's so hard for me to say, will it actually benefit or hurt the party for whom that host city was supposed to be held. I look back to 2016. And the Democrats held their convention in Philadelphia. Hillary Clinton went on to lose the state of Pennsylvania. And when you talk to Democratic operatives about what happened there, I haven't heard from too many people that it was it was due to the convention. It comes down to the fact that it was due to organizing and investment and, turnout amongst specific groups of people that the Democrats needed. And that's what I think it will largely come down to again in Wisconsin, with or without the convention. And again, I just look back at what happened in how close Pennsylvania was in 2016. And that maybe makes me think that could be the same case. The other thing I'm interested in, though, Joy, from your perspective, is I was recently down in Jacksonville, Florida, where I'm sure the Republicans were supposed to host their convention. And President Trump is no longer going to be speaking in Jacksonville. He'll be speaking from the White House. But the Republican Party chairman in Duval County, which is home to Jacksonville, told me that because there were all these plans to bring the convention to town, they had been able to build up an extensive volunteer list that they did not have prior to the convention. And I want to say it was somewhere in the range of 5,000 people. And so he felt like that was one positive, that with or without the convention, they now have this extensive volunteer list that perhaps they wouldn't have had prior to that. So I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, I don't know, has the local Democratic Party been able to boost engagement or volunteer numbers or just organizing around the theoretical assumption that the convention was going to be here?
I think they definitely have volunteers here who were planning to be a part of the DNC. I'm not sure if they've transitioned them into being a part of the campaign at large. It seems like I'm inclined to say anecdotally no.
Okay, yeah.
But I know that there are people who have become more involved as a result of the DNC being here, not necessarily with the campaign itself, but in other ancillary organizations.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it'll be, to me, really interesting. I mean, the other component, Joy, that I should mention that I have heard a lot about this summer in terms of reporting has been less about Joe Biden, and it's been around the president's response to the pandemic or the president's response to racial protests. And so there is a lot of energy I've been hearing from a number of young African-American voters around both of those issues. And again, in Florida, I heard from a young woman who told me that prior to this summer, she was a big Bernie Sanders supporter. She remains a strong supporter of Senator Sanders. But prior to this summer's events and prior to how the president handled everything, the pandemic and the protests, she wasn't sure she was going to vote. And her takeaway was, just after looking at tens of thousands of deaths in this country because of COVID, she now feels like even if she does not like Joe Biden, he would not behave or have behaved in such a way, she feels, around handling the pandemic. And, to the degree that external factors are at play, this also feels fundamentally different than 2016, because you have a sitting president who many voters can judge based on how he's handled the economy, say, or the public health crisis or racial issues. And whether or not they are enthusiastic about Joe Biden, I had a county chairman tell me that frankly doesn't matter. This is a Democratic county chairman who said it doesn't matter because he doesn't need to have people vote with, a 10 out of 10 level of enthusiasm. He just needs them to vote for Joe Biden.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to one of our listener questions. Comparing this election cycle to previous ones, what are you doing differently to get quality answers to questions from candidates and from voters?
So from candidates, I will be candid, it is a challenge. I don't cover the Republicans as much. That's mostly our White House team, but let me maybe start there. With President Trump, we have a candidate, a president, who's running for reelection, who is accessible to the public, right? He does do these press conferences often in the afternoons, but he's not truthful with information. And I will say that that has been a challenge for many journalists in terms of figuring out how to cover him. On the other side, I look at someone like Joe Biden. I have been with him at a couple of pool events. He's, done a couple, I will say, of press conferences, but he, in my view, is not nearly as accessible as I would like him to be at this point, if I'm speaking totally candidly for myself. But I will say, I don't think I'm even speaking for myself. I think a number of journalists would agree. He had this very public rollout with Kamala Harris last week in Delaware. And there was an assumption from many journalists that they might take questions together. They have not sat down for a press conference and been readily accessible to the press. So in terms of getting substantive answers from Joe Biden, it has been a challenge because there are not very many venues for us to question him as journalists. He will often do local TV interviews. Periodically, he'll do some national TV hits. He did do an interview recently for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and the National Association of Black Journalists with one of my colleagues, Lulu Garcia Navarro. But that was a rare moment. Really, he hasn't done long form press conferences on a regular basis. And then, Joy, when it comes to voters, how do you work around trying to make sure you have substantive interviews with people? A couple of ways. One of them goes back to the fact that I do spend a lot of time prepping before I go to a place, calling around, trying to figure out who I should talk to and pre-interviewing them. I think back to being in Jacksonville, Florida. I spent probably a week before I went down there just calling every day, getting in touch. And some of this is, you reach out to the Republican or the Democratic Party leadership. Some of this was also going back through files, figuring out that this area had been very staunchly Republican under the years where George W. Bush and Jeb Bush were there. And so I went through and found people who had been strong donors, strong supporters of the Bushes. And I wanted to see where they were now. And it was a matter of calling them up, pre-interviewing them, and then asking them for who else I should speak to. So it's a lot more legwork, I will say, than what a traditional campaign cycle might feel like.
Now we have just a few more minutes here, but I want to end on this question because so much of our conversation has been about how atypical this entire election season has been, but also the campaigns. I mean, the inaccessibility of the candidates is something that's fairly atypical for an election. Do you think this election has the potential to really change the future of campaigning? Do you think this is going to set a new standard for campaigns and election seasons?
I mean, that's a really thought-provoking question, Joy. It's so hard for me to envision what a normal campaign right now will feel like. But what I will say is, if moving forward, the candidates remain this inaccessible, I don't believe that it will be acceptable to voters or to journalists. Right now, there is an understanding from Democratic voters in particular, whom I talked to and I asked them about Joe Biden. It is acceptable to them that he's not holding large-scale rallies, say in Wisconsin or Michigan. That being said, I have also heard from some Democrats who have voiced to me that they wish that he could travel out and see them in some sort of safe way, whether it was in a small group setting akin to what he's done maybe in Delaware or Pennsylvania. But I think there's a willingness to be okay with the fact that he's not necessarily going to be able to come out in person because of the pandemic. If there was no pandemic, I'm fairly confident voters would not be this willing to have a candidate who's just not physically as accessible for them. And I would say, in terms of being a journalist, I think, some of us are frustrated with or without the pandemic because, we know that we can be there for a pool event. So our argument is, if we can be there for a pool speech, we can certainly also be there for a pool press conference.
Yeah. Well, Asma Khalid, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. I think I speak for all of us when I say I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you as we near the general election.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Right. Asma Khalid is a co-host of the NPR Politics podcast and a political correspondent for NPR who is currently covering the Biden-Harris campaign. This is 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, host of Lake Effect. And in another reality, this year would have looked a lot different for me and the Lake Effect team. Like many of our listeners, we had high hopes for the Democratic National Convention here in Milwaukee. We were expecting to be running around, looking for people to talk with us, poring over notes and questions with local political analysts, and giving you day-to-day updates about everything that was happening on the convention floor. But times have changed. Now, like much of the country, we're sitting at our computer screens. In my case, I'm sitting at a computer screen in front of a very high-definition camera, which is a little unusual for a radio journalist. Luckily, we're still able to bring you perspectives from political analysts and veteran political reporters like Ron Elving. Many of you will be familiar with his work as a senior editor and correspondent on the Washington desk for NPR News. What you may not know is that Ron used to be the state Capitol bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal. Again, we want to hear from you. Leave us a comment with questions that you have about this election. But Ron Elving, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Joy. Great to be back in Milwaukee. You know, before I was in Madison, I was a number of years in Milwaukee for the Journal. This was before the merger with the Sentinel. And I covered City Hall. I covered Henry Meyer when he was the mayor. I covered John Norquist a little bit just before he became the mayor. So if those names still mean something to anyone other than as the name of the Summerfest Park, that was my era as a cub reporter for the Milwaukee Journal.
So you have real Milwaukee roots here.
Oh, yes. I have family in Milwaukee. My daughter lives there. And so, yes, we still feel very close to Milwaukee. My wife also worked for the Journal.
Oh, nice. You know, getting to my question, sorry. The cancellation of most of the in-person portions of the Milwaukee DNC, it was certainly upsetting for a lot of us who had prepared for it. But, you know, I was talking to Asma a bit about this. There's this larger question about what it could mean for the Democratic Party here in Wisconsin. So I'd like to start here. Do these conventions generally have an impact on voting in your experience?
Yes, in a very broad sense, they have had. Historically, I don't think there's any question. We have seen conventions that made a tremendous difference, particularly for the Republicans in 1988 coming out of New Orleans. Mike Dukakis, the Democratic nominee, had a huge lead after his convention in Atlanta, and it melted away. It melted away very quickly, and largely because the Republicans had a very successful convention of their own. That was the nomination of George H.W. Bush. And we at that time thought George H.W. Bush was never going to be president. Of course, he wound up being president himself and then having his son be president for 2 terms. So conventions can really make a difference, at least in the historic and conventional convention sense. You know, right now, who knows, right? What we saw last night, although I thought it was stirring at many times and meaningful, was not as exciting as seeing 25, 30,000, 35,000 people in a stadium or in a big basketball arena like Fiserv. So, you know, broke my heart personally that Milwaukee, having waited so long, decades, generations, to get a shot at a national convention, should have its shot and then have it so cruelly taken away by the virus and the crisis, and maybe not even to the virus, but just the degree to which it has been poorly handled in this country, to the degree that we can't even have a gathering of this kind. Perhaps it would never have been possible once the virus emerged, but it would have been nice to have at least had a little more of a chance.
Yeah, and I will say my producers wanted me to point out the Milwaukee poster, which I did not notice in the back corner there, an East Side poster.
The Oriental Theater.
Yeah, and actually they've used this time to do some pretty impressive update. So,
Yes.
you know, but your answer gets to a question I have. Is the fact that the DNC was planned, but then didn't happen here in Milwaukee, could that be detrimental to Democrats here in Wisconsin?
I suppose, and it largely depends, I think, on whom you blame for the convention not happening. Now, tonight, the session will be gavelled into order, although that's, again, a kind of a virtual thing, by Tom Barrett. And I'm sure that Tom's going to put the blame where he thinks it is or belongs. Certainly, it should not be put on those who decided that you could not take a chance with the health, not only of the people who are going to be in Pfizer when that was going to be the venue, but all the people of the city, because you're going to have thousands and thousands of people working at any convention. They're going to be bringing the food. They're going to be serving the food. They're going to be cleaning up afterwards. And they're going to be in and about all these delegates coming from 57 places, 50 states, 7 kinds of territories, the District of Columbia, and they're going to bring the virus from wherever it is. I mean, it's just like you asked for it. And it came to you from wherever it was thriving in the country. And as we've seen with schools that tried to reopen, and as we've seen in countries that thought they had it licked, it only takes a handful of cases to suddenly get community spread and have a big hotspot again. The chances of that happening were just too great. And I would give credit to those who made the decision fairly early on in the Democratic Party to scale back, to dial back, and then finally to say, look, we just can't have a normal convention for the sake of the health, not only of the delegates who would be coming, but for the sake of all the people in Milwaukee who would be exposed.
To that point, it seems that since the DNC decided to be virtual, the Trump-Pence campaign has actually stepped up its on-the-ground efforts here in Wisconsin, actually coming to the state a lot this week. Do you think that might give an edge to Republicans in the state, or do you think voters might see this as negligent?
The voters will probably be making up their minds about how they feel about President Trump on the basis of other things. Now, if it's a really close call for some voters, and we know there are many swing counties, Craig Gilbert, who's a brilliant reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, long time observer of the state, has identified 18 counties that generally vote with the winner. So they voted with Scott Walker and then they voted against him. And they voted with Tammy Baldwin, but then they also voted with Ron Johnson, a very, very different senator. So these 18 swing counties, that's not Milwaukee County, obviously, and none of the counties in the Milwaukee area. But those counties, they're usually fairly closely divided, and perhaps 2, 3, 4 percentage points might make a difference in those 18 counties. Frankly, none of them was going to have a lot of impact from having the convention here in Milwaukee. They're actually, most of them, fairly close, or relatively close. They're more on the west, northwest side of the state. They're closer to the Twin Cities than they are really to the Milwaukee area or southeastern Wisconsin. So I don't think a lot of people there are going to take it terribly personally that Joe Biden did not come here physically. They might. And I certainly could understand why people in Milwaukee would blame Biden personally for not insisting that the convention be here. But the reason it's not there was based on rational bases. And one could say, and we were going to be in North Carolina next week. We were going to be in North Carolina and Charlotte, where the Democrats had their convention in 2012, to do the Republican convention. And the president insisted that they have a typical, everyone in a big hall. The governor said you can't do that under our current circumstances. After that conflict developed, suddenly North Carolina's situation got much worse with the virus. So the president tried to move it to Jacksonville, and Jacksonville said we don't want it either. So in the end, he's probably going to give his acceptance speech a week from Thursday night. Here in Washington, he's talking about having it outside the White House. I can tell you that would not be a pleasant weather experience in late August, but let's just say it works out for them meteorologically. That certainly isn't a typical convention or either, but at least you have the backdrop of the White House.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, of course, these 18 counties in Wisconsin. And it sounds, knowing approximately where they are, these are more rural areas. And something that I've been hearing, at least from rural family of mine, is a lot of concern over what's happening with USPS. Now, we have a question from one of the listeners. What is Mr. Elving following with regard to the post office issue? Is that something that you're covering right now?
Oh, indeed. In fact, I would say it's the hottest issue. Even in the midst of two conventions, it's the hottest issue in politics at the moment is what's going on with the post office. Now, Louis DeJoy, who your listeners probably know, has been appointed as the Postmaster General by President Trump. That individual, who had no experience with the Postal Service, but who was a donor to the president, has made a great number of changes. He's put limits on overtime. If you've ever been involved with the post office at all, you know how much it relies on overtime at times of heavy mail flow, such as Christmas. And around an election, if it's going to be a mail-in situation, as it has been in some states for a number of years now. So he has been, in a sense, hobbling the post office at a moment of its maximum pressure and utility to the democracy. Not, I suppose, to impute his motives here, but there have been fiscal problems with the post office. They've been struggling. There's been less use of the mail, more people using private services such as FedEx and so on. And we do know that the post office has had other fiscal problems, but to deal with them in this way at this time obviously raises political questions. So Mr. DeJoy has been called to testify before Congress. He is going to testify on the 24th, I believe that's Monday, before a House committee. And he has also agreed just this morning to testify this Friday before a Senate committee. And the House is going to meet this weekend and pass a bill that would appropriate an extra $25 billion, real money in anybody's economy, to help the post office deal with its fiscal problems, not just with the election, but certainly to keep them at maximum strength for the election, anticipating that their budget would be taken care of by a larger appropriation. So one assumes that if the Senate were to go along, and that's a big if, the president has said he doesn't want more funding for the post office. He wants to cut costs. Okay. The question then becomes, if the Senate will pass that $25 billion for the post office, will the president veto that money? That, it seems to me, would be an extraordinary act that would attract a great deal of attention and send a certain political message, which the president, to some people, is already sending, but it would make it clear, I think, to absolutely everyone what he was up to.
Now, full disclosure, my partner is actually a UPS provider. He drives the trucks around and delivers packages. And something I will say is, since the pandemic began, he has been working a lot more. They've had a lot of packages in their system. He's compared it to Christmas at times, and this overtime issue is a big deal because they are reliant on so many people right now. A lot of people I know have also switched to, as a result of the pandemic, getting things like prescriptions by mail. Are we hearing from voters this level of concern? Because we're certainly hearing it from politicians who are reconvening. Are we hearing that borne out in the voice of voters?
I think we're hearing it from politicians largely because they're hearing it from their constituents. So if I'm a congressman or a senator or whatever level I'm at, I'm going to get calls from people saying, I can't get my drugs, I can't get my check. Many people depend on a Social Security check or another kind of assistance payment or benefit that might be a pension benefit that arrives in the mail. Now, some people get them straight into their bank account, but there are a great number of people who still rely on the mail. And by the way, may I salute your partner, because they are now frontline workers, like the people in the hospitals, like the people who went back to restaurants, like the people who went back to their jobs, partly because they needed the income, but also partly because they knew they were providing a service that in the midst of this crisis is desperately needed. So yes, the Postal Service is being, if you will, politicized, which is a shame. It is an institution that has been largely outside the fray of politics. That is a shame, but in even before that, preceding that, you have the enormous importance that's being put on the service that they deliver in the midst of this pandemic. So to have this ladled on top, to have this further burden placed on them, is extraordinarily unfortunate. One thing to be pleased or grateful for is that this crisis, if we're going to call it a crisis, is coming to our attention and being dealt with in the month of August, as opposed to the month of October, which would be all the more fraught.
Yeah. Turning back a bit to the campaigns to some extent, but this election, it's relatively rare in modern history for us to have one-term presidents. And it's relatively difficult to beat an incumbent. When we go back over the last 40 years, there have been two. There's been President Jimmy Carter and President George H.W. Bush. Is there something that stands out as connecting these presidencies and the reasons they weren't reelected?
It would probably be the sense that people had, and I covered the 1980 campaign, and Jimmy Carter was suffering from a number of perceived problems. One, of course, was the economy, where interest rates were extraordinarily high, as people are paying now 3 and 4% for mortgages. At the time, people were paying 12 and 13% for mortgages. And the inflation rate was the reason, and the inflation rate was insane. So the kinds of numbers people today can't even relate to. So people were upset about that. And then there, of course, were the 50 some odd hostages in Tehran being held for a year by protesters there who had taken over the U.S. embassy. That was an enormously humiliating event for the people of the United States. One of them was a young man from Milwaukee. So this was something that was very much on everyone's mind at the time. And when Ronald Reagan increasingly put himself forward as a plausible alternative, an attractive alternative. And now when we think back on 8 years of Ronald Reagan's presidency, it seems a no-brainer that he would have been considered highly acceptable as an alternative to the incumbent president in 1980, but it was a question mark that fall. And he had to sell himself. They only had one debate. It was right before the election. He did extraordinarily well. It was Ronald Reagan at his best. And what resulted was pretty much a landslide. 1992, George H.W. Bush, whom I mentioned before, had a reasonably successful first term in many respects, but a recession had begun about a year before the election, and that recession might have actually already technically ended in 1992, but people didn't feel that way. People felt like the recession was very much still with them, and they were still very much dealing with its after effects, even if it was over. And the president did not seem to be terribly concerned about that. His advisors kept telling him, there's no recession. Don't cop to it. Don't act as though you think things are bad. They're really not that bad. That was unfortunate. Also, he was dealing with a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who wound up getting 19% of the vote. A lot of it came from people who had voted for Bush in the previous election. And then, of course, speaking of charm and Ronald Reagan, there was a lot of charm associated with young Bill Clinton in 1992. By the way, both Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton are expected to be on the program tonight. So we will see those Democratic characters brought back. And that's how Bill Clinton got to be president. And that was almost 30 years ago. And as you say, the other defeat of an incumbent was 40 years ago. So you're quite right. We, generally speaking, re-elect our presidents.
You know, you mentioned both Reagan and Clinton had this level of charm and charisma. Do we see that in Biden?
No, I don't think people would compare Joe Biden's personality to either Ronald Reagan, longtime Hollywood star, or Bill Clinton with all of his gifts as a person who related well to a wide variety of folks and could do it not only one-to-one, small groups, but he could do it on stage, and he could do it particularly effectively on television. That is not in Joe Biden's quiver. He doesn't really have that particular skill. He's particularly, I think, unsuccessful oftentimes on television as a communicator. Now, last night, for example, I think you saw a lot of people talking about his other strengths. We heard the word decent a lot. We heard empathy a lot. He's not flashy. He's not a Hollywood star. I think that's been pretty well established. Plus, there's also the age difference. Ronald Reagan was getting on in years when he was first elected president, but he wasn't nearly as old as Joe Biden, and he still looked pretty great. Joe Biden, when he first ran for president way back in the 1980s, it's hard to think, but a third of a century ago, we were talking about Joe Biden, presidential candidate. At that time, he was much younger and much more dynamic and was seen as an aggressive speaker. And so no one would recognize, perhaps, some of the things that I'm saying about Joe Biden today. I'm not saying that Joe Biden can't give a great speech on Thursday night or can't have some debate performances this fall that are good. I'm not saying that he won't be enormously charming much of the time. I'm just saying that compared to iconic figures in those departments, such as Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, those are not his salient strengths.
Now, you touched on this a bit, the economy being one of these. Historically, what are the most important issues for candidates during elections, and how are we seeing that play out in this very atypical election?
First of all, there's the famous "It's the economy, stupid." That came from 1992 in the Clinton campaign. It was said by his campaign manager, James Carville. And of course, the opposition candidate, the person who's trying to beat the incumbent, is going to stress as the salient, most important issue, whatever is not going well. Now, in the current moment, there are a number of things to stress. Obviously, the virus and the crisis that's got us all in these strange situations. That's number one. Number two is the recession that's resulting from that. And number three, and really I shouldn't put these in an ordinal sense because they're really interrelated and they're of equal importance. The third is the social unrest in the country that resulted not only from the killing of George Floyd, but from the perception. And I think it has been more generally accepted and appreciated than ever before on the part of a wide swath of America that George Floyd was not an anomaly, that the killing of Black people by police has been accepted far, far too long. And that too is an issue that means as much to much of our population as anything else that we're talking about. So to have all three of those at the same time, that's highly unusual. Foreign policy sometimes matters a lot. It certainly did in 1980. But unless foreign policy is the issue, the sailing over everything else issue, such as Vietnam, then it, generally speaking, is not what people vote on. People vote on things that are much closer to home.
Yeah. I'm going to get to a couple of listener questions here, and we've gotten this one actually a couple times. How inappropriate will it be if Trump accepts the nomination from the White House?
There is a question as to whether or not one is permitted to use the White House for political events. There is a very real question as to its legality and certainly its propriety. Most presidents have avoided that by doing straight up political events, such as accepting a party's presidential nomination from someplace else. That makes sense, right? Since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, the nominees have always gone to the convention and said, thanks a lot, I accept. Don't know of any that have said, no thanks, I won't accept, at least not in my memory. So it's generally speaking, why bother to trouble those who will be troubled by making a political use or abuse, misuse of taxpayer-paid resources. Obviously, presidents do political things all the time in the White House, and oftentimes they're seen on television doing political things in the White House. But generally speaking, those things can be seen as part of their job, part of their administrative duties, part of their legislative duties, part of what a president is elected to do. Presidents are not necessarily elected simply to run for re-election. And to perform such an important part of your re-election campaign using taxpayer resources, using the symbol of the White House as your backdrop, your stage setting, I can certainly see why some people, you don't have to be an overly traditionalist American to find that troubling. I suspect that there will be someone in the administration who will deliver the opinion that it does not violate any laws.
Now, the next question gets to, I should say, we're talking during the DNC, what would have been a much larger event here in Milwaukee, which is now mostly virtual. And that gets to this listener question. Do you think 2020 will mark the end of conventions as we know them or used to know them?
Great question. Great question. Is it going to be the end of going to the office 5 days a week from 9 to 6? Is it going to be the end of people feeling that they can only do their jobs with a lot of other people around them? Are we going to change our lifestyle? Is school ever going to be quite the same? One thing most people I've talked to feel right now is more appreciation for what they gained by going to an office or working with their coworkers in physical proximity. Certainly, I teach at American University, and we are totally online this fall. It's nowhere near as satisfying to teach online as it is to teach in the presence of your students. And I generally have the impression that students feel very much the same way. They'd rather be with their peers. They'd rather be with their classmates. They would rather be seeing the professor in a presence, as a presence. Seeing the professor right there gives you more of a sense that you can question that person, that you aren't just being preached to, as it were, on a screen. I think students really appreciate college for a lot of things other than the classroom too. But even in the classroom experience, which then becomes much more part of the rest of the college experience because you are physically all together on a campus, that's missed. I think it's enormously missed. It's one of the reasons people have been so eager to get the schools back open, even with all the risks. So in that same sense, many of us are going to want to go back to having a political convention 4 years from now. I really, really hope that the Democratic National Committee will decide to have a regular convention, and they will decide to have it where it should have been this week in the Fiserv. I really owe that to the city of Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin to bring it back to where they had intended to have it and where everyone expected it to be. So for that reason alone, I hope the conventions come back. And one other observation there, if one party brings it back, the other party will go along.
Well, and that gets to this question, I believe also from a listener. You know, since you didn't get to cover the DNC from Milwaukee, and since you do have family here, are you planning to visit sometime soon? And what are you most looking forward to doing when you get here?
Well, I was actually tempted to wear my Wolski's t-shirt here, but that would be unprofessional.
Did you close down Wolski's?
I don't think I ever really officially closed Wolski's because the bar laws in those years were even more liberal than they are today. But I certainly enjoyed Wolski's, and there are so many things really. I'm a Summerfest person. I come to Summerfest pretty much every year. I was really looking forward to coming initially, of course, in normal time, but then September when they delayed it, and I was terribly disappointed when they canceled it outright. So I won't be coming for that. But I certainly look forward to coming next year. I certainly look forward to coming to NBA games next year. It's just frustrating, obviously, the Bucks having such a fabulous season, and then to have this happen. It'll always be, what would have been, what could have been if it hadn't been for the virus. I love going to Miller Park. I love going to Kosciuszko Park. I love the South Side. Really seriously, I really very much look forward to coming back. And if it's not for the holidays this year, after the election, then I hope it's very soon thereafter.
Nice. I will say I'm not a huge sports fan, but I've become a very big and fervent Bucks fan.
How could you not?
How could you not? With Giannis Antetokounmpo, come on. I'll learn his name.
Yeah. Well, there was a time when the Bucks won the NBA with a guy named Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as their center. A lot of people think of him as having played for the Lakers, but he started his career winning the NBA for Milwaukee Bucks.
It's true. All right. Well, Ron, Elving, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you so much for your expertise.
Oh, Joy, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Ron Elving is a senior editor and correspondent on the Washington desk for NPR News and the former state capitol bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal. I'd like to thank everybody listening and or watching for joining us today, for caring about politics here in Wisconsin, and for lending us your questions. I think we're good.